I encourage you to keep your Bibles open to Ecclesiastes 10 as we continue making our way through this wonderful book. If you, like me, come to Stonebridge from the south or from the southeast, or if you ever find yourself heading down Stony Point Road and hanging a left on Dean Road over to the little roundabout there on Williams, then you will know that for the last year or so, that stretch from Stony Point to the roundabout on Dean has been a bit of an obstacle course. There are entire sections of the road that have just disintegrated over the last year. And they've attempted patching jobs here and there, but even on the best days with the right traffic and trying to swerve and not bottom out your car, it can be a bit of an obstacle course. There's a good reason that Scripture often uses roads or paths as analogies for life. You think about how many times you're on a road and you don't quite know, there's a destination, but you don't know what's around the corner. You don't know what dead ends or detours you'll encounter. You don't know what hazards might be waiting for you. It's really a rich metaphor in the Bible. And a metaphor that reminds us of the necessity of living life with our eyes wide open. Imagine the stupidity of trying to drive Dean Road at 35 miles an hour with your eyes closed. That's just not going to end well for anybody. So it is that walking through life, the importance of living with our eyes open, or in other words, living wisely. Living wisely. Godly wisdom opens our eyes to be able to walk with God faithfully, even when the path in front of us is not straight or smooth and is full of hazards. So our passage this morning that kind of opens that idea to us is actually a continuation of the text that we looked at last week. So we're starting clear back in chapter 9, verse 11, where the preacher addresses this idea of what does true success look like in an upside-down world, in a world that doesn't work the way that we expect it to, in a world that doesn't really satisfy, a world that certainly doesn't value what God values, at least not all of the time. And what we saw is that in contrast to the wisdom of the world and how it defines success in terms of money, power, prestige, all of those different categories, what we saw from the preacher was that true success is defined by faithfulness to God and faith in his purposes. That's the measure. That's what wise living is all about faithfulness to God and faith in his purposes. Wisdom helps us keep our eyes on the road and to be able to recognize life's dangers, particularly the dangers of foolishness and folly. And so what we're going to see this morning as we kind of finish this extended section of Proverbs in the book of Ecclesiastes is that godly wisdom opens our eyes to walk faithfully with God in the often uneven paths that we find in our life. So that's where the preacher is going to bring us. And to kind of illustrate this and drive it home, he highlights four different dangers, four different car-eating potholes that we need to be aware of as we make our way through this vaporous world. And not just what they are, but how to avoid them. Now, just as potholes can be random on a road, the preacher's instructions here feel a little bit random. He's kind of addressing all sorts of different life circumstances, but we can kind of see four general categories of warning that he gives us here, and how godly wisdom keeps our eyes open to them and helps us be able to move forward with faithfulness. And so the first hazard that he points out in verse 8 is the danger of greed. The danger of greed, or more specifically of robbing others, which comes from taking your eyes off of the path in front of you and fixing them on things that belong to somebody else. That becomes our observation and obsession. So if you look again at verse 8, he who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. This is a lovely, obscure metaphor, right? He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. Now, some take this verse to refer to just kind of honest laborers going about their jobs and tragedies happening, kind of what we see in verse 9, which we'll get to in a moment. But the imagery of digging a pit and falling into it in the Old Testament is a metaphor for poetic justice, for the kind of justice where whatever you were attempting to do to somebody actually falls back on yourself. They dig a pit along the road. Somebody who's trying to rob somebody digs a pit on the road to set a trap so that travelers will fall into it, but in the process falls into and becomes trapped themselves. That's the picture here. We see this, for instance, in Psalm 7. Behold, the wicked man conceives evil and is pregnant with mischief and gives birth to lies. He makes a pit, digging it out, and falls into the hole that he has made. His mischief returns upon his own head, and on his skull his violence descends. So this poetic justice, that's the picture there. And the second half of the verse illustrates something similar. Breaking through a wall is breaking and entering. It's taking the bricks and mud and stones or whatever of an ancient house and digging them out in order to create your own little window to sneak in and steal stuff. That's what's happening, except here it's met with the same result. As the dude's digging through the wall, he gets bit by a snake who's living in the wall that he's trying to dig through. It's a poetic justice. It is utterly foolish and dangerous to think that we can take advantage of others and not have our folly come back on our own heads, to not ever face any sort of consequences, whether on earth or in heaven. That's the picture here. Now, I would venture to guess that most of you are not sitting here plotting burglary or armed robbery. I'm assuming that's a safe assumption, and I get an amen, right? Oh, thank you. Good. That's good. That doesn't mean that we don't still deal with greed, though, right? Or this temptation to take advantage of others for our own selfish gain. We might not have the skills of a burglar, but we often have the heart of one, in terms of trying to get what we want without having to pay for it, right? From the seemingly insignificant ways we do that, stealing your roommate's streaming passwords so you don't have to get a subscription yourself, or, illegally downloading music. Is that still a thing? I don't know. To more, other ways we try to avoid or take advantage of what belongs to someone else, padding our expenses so that we can get a little bit more money out of the job, or cheating on our taxes, or to flat out sabotaging someone else's career or job in order to land that better position or land that better client. We want things, and sometimes we want them so badly that we just kind of plug our ears to God's voice and just plow through taking what we think we really deserve, right? This is deadly and foolish. And the stupidest part of it is thinking that we'll get away with it, that we'll never face justice. When you stop and think about where this comes from, what could make me plug my ears to God and pursue these kind of greedy ends? When you think about where it comes from, this kind of greediness really reflects a very small view of God. A very small view of God. It's a small view of God's goodness, that he's not really the kind of God who would provide for me what I need, and so I need to take it for myself instead. He's just not that good. Or a small view of God's holiness, that God is not so great and set apart and perfect, and so sin isn't actually that big of a deal. Or a small view of God's power, that even if he is good enough, he's not able to give me what I need, or even if he is holy enough, he's not actually powerful enough to judge those who do wrong. And it reflects an incredibly small view of God's mercy, that he hasn't really done very much to meet my needs or to rescue me from trouble, not least my own rebellion against him. It's a small view of God that feeds a greedy heart. And this small view of God will create really big problems on that day when we meet him face to face. And so wisdom, if wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, with recognizing that God is God and I am not, and honoring and upholding his holiness and power, if wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord, then wisdom points us to focus on the bigness of God, on the greatness and grandeur and majesty of God. It reminds us that he really is good and kind and worthy and holy, that he is uniquely worthy of our obedience and joy. It reminds us of his power, that he alone in all of the universe is able to actually accomplish what he intends. And there is not a single force in heaven, on earth, or under the earth that could stop him. There is no one more powerful than our God. And it moves us to depend on his mercy, which he has demonstrated. When you wrestle with whether or not I can trust God's goodness or power or mercy, think back to the cross. That's where he has demonstrated the greatness of both his holiness and his mercy in sending his son to take on himself the results of our greed, the sin in our own hearts and lives, by giving his life on the cross so that he could redeem us from all of that, that through faith in him, we might be pardoned of our sin and adopted into his family. There is no greater power or holiness or mercy than in the Lord. Our hearts want things and often want them now. The wisdom of God reminds us that he is the giver of all good things. And he has given us the best thing in giving us his son. So that is the first hazard to be aware of and avoid, this hazard of robbing others, the danger of greed. The second danger we encounter, the second hazard, is the danger of carelessness, or rushing into a task without weighing the potential for harm. We see this in verses 9 to 11 and verse 15. So this is what happens when you take your eyes off the path in front of you and you fix them so narrowly on the prize that you no longer notice the hazards right underneath your own nose. I just want to get that, and we become blind to all of the potential danger standing in our way. So look again at verses 9 to 11. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, you must use more strength. But wisdom helps one succeed. If the serpent bites before it's charmed, there's no advantage to the charmer. So you have here three examples of tasks or occupations or jobs from the ancient world, and honestly still around today, splitting logs and quarrying stones. You can find that in our own backyard. Charming snakes, got to go overseas for that one probably, but some people still do that. So these different jobs or tasks, and each one of them involves a certain level of danger or risk, right? The picture here is of someone jumping into a task carelessly, like needlessly injuring themselves or making the work harder than it needs to be. If the iron's blunt and you don't sharpen it, it takes a whole lot more force and strength and energy to get through the wood. And so a little wisdom goes a long way in helping us accomplish what God gives us to do. Sometimes that means slowing down, taking the time to sharpen the axe before you start swinging, putting on the bicycle helmet before you go for the ride, double checking the safety on the table saw before you stick your hand in there, right? Sometimes it means slowing down. Sometimes wisdom means hurrying up. If you don't charm the snake before it bites, it doesn't do any good to charm it. If you don't jump on the plane when you catch word of your dying relative, you might not get there in time to see them. So sometimes it means hurrying, sometimes it means slowing down. The wise person will approach a task with the careful thought necessary to accomplish it. Now you think about that and you read those verses, And in a lot of ways, what we're talking about here is common sense, right? This is pretty common sense. It doesn't take divine wisdom to know that it's a good idea to look both ways before crossing the street, right? To slow down, take in the situation, and then move. But it also raises the question of, why is it so hard for us to listen to common sense? There's something about common sense that isn't always very common. So what is it that causes us to jump carelessly into a task when it shouldn't be that hard to know better? Sometimes we're so excited about the prize, we're so eager for the result, that we jump in without counting the cost. Building an addition on the house and finding out halfway through we've run out of money and the bank won't loan us anymore. A little bit of research could have helped avoid that dilemma, right? Or adding a new product line to the business that I'm really excited about and nobody else is interested in buying. A little market research could have told me not to expand the line that direction, right? Or firing off an angry email when 30 seconds of reflection probably could have predicted the devastating results, right? So thinking carefully, we get so excited or so focused on the prize that we don't count the cost before diving in. Or sometimes it's the pride that comes with experience and familiarity. I've done this 100 times. I've driven this route 1,000 times and I've never seen that stop sign before, right? Or sometimes it's the pride that comes from just simply presuming that we know what we're doing. Trust me, I'm an expert. I don't know how many dads here have set out to assemble some elaborate toy for their child by first discarding the instructions. I've got this, I can do this. And then 3 hours later, you're Googling how to undo what you did. And what should have been 20 minutes is now this entire day task. Our presumption can get us into trouble. As verse 15 puts it, the toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. A fool who just thinks he's got it all figured out, but doesn't actually know what he's doing. It's a lot more energy than it needs to be. And so even though what we need here is just simply a little bit of common sense, we need the grace of God to open our eyes to our need for common sense, to be able to see our pride or our stubbornness or our inherent foolishness that fixates on the end goal without watching for the hazards that lie between. And so the danger of greed, the danger of carelessness, the third road hazard in verses 12 to 14 and verse 20 is the danger of foolish speech, of running our mouths in arrogance and folly. This is kind of like the guy who's so into the story he's telling you while you're riding in his car that he spends all of his time looking at the passenger instead of the road in front of him. That's what's going on here. Verses 12 to 14. The words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him. The danger of foolish speech. Now, he starts with the benefit of speaking wise words, right? The words of the wise will win favor or even perhaps give grace, depending on how you translate that. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But the overwhelming emphasis is this warning against foolish speech, running our mouths, which in this passage is self-destructive, evil, and arrogant. Running our mouths. It's self-destructive, evil, and arrogant. You see the imagery in verse 12. Picture this word picture here. The lips of a fool consume him. Right? So the lips of a fool consume him. It's running your mouth is like eating your own body. It's self-destructive. That's the picture. It's kind of gross, and it's supposed to be. This self-destructive action of speaking foolishly. And It's not hard to illustrate that. How often do we find ourselves with our mouths getting us into trouble? Like we say things we know we shouldn't say, and they come back to bite us and make life worse. And the more we say, the deeper the hole we tend to dig, and so on. And sometimes we don't even intend what's coming out of our mouths to be heard by anybody else. Sometimes we think we're just kind of venting and complaining, but somehow those words catch wind and find their way to the person that we're talking about, like a little birdie told them, as in verse 20. Even in your thought, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature will tell the matter. Somehow, our foolish words have a way of finding their target, whether we intend them to or not. I've always thought it was kind of ironic that the social media platform that has caused so much trouble for people getting themselves fired for what they say was called Twitter. This little birdie going around telling everybody else what you're thinking. I mean, politicians, Olympic athletes, all kinds of employees have lost their jobs because of things they've tweeted or said on social media. So just a word to the wise, never put anything on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook that you don't want the entire world to see, because they can see it. Like, keep the thoughts to ourselves. That's his point here. Don't let that speech come out. But foolish speech is not only self-destructive, it's also destructive to others as well. It begins with foolishness, and it ends in evil madness. Just chaos and carnage. Our words have the power to cause incredible harm. The book of James warns us that the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. For every kind of beast and bird, every reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. The reality is, every one of us has one of those things in our mouths. Nobody is immune from self-destructive or damaging or foolish speech. Paul Tripp offers us a helpful diagnostic. When I think back, how foolish is my speech? He helps us think through this. He gives us this diagnostic to think about. He writes, listen to the talk that goes on in your home. How much of it is impatient and unkind? How often are words spoken out of selfishness or personal desire? How easily do outbursts of anger occur? How often do we bring up past wrongs? How do we fail to communicate hope? How do we fail to protect? How often do our words carry threats? Stop and listen, and you'll see how much we need to hold our talk to a standard of love, and how often the truth we profess to speak has been distorted by sin. Our words can get us into so much trouble. Foolish talk is evil. It brings harm to others. But worse than that, it's plentiful. It's not just dangerous, it's plentiful. Fools love to hear their own voices speak, especially when they have no clue what they're talking about. It's like being at a party or some social gathering, and there's always that one guy who, somebody tells a story and they have to one-up it, or somebody offers just a fact of something, an observation, and they have to well, that's nothing. Let me tell you about this. And they just always and by the end, you're like, I don't think they actually know what they're talking about. There's always that guy, right? A fool multiplies his words, though no man knows what is to be. And we call this pride. This is pride and arrogance, right? It's thinking more highly of ourselves than our neighbor or even than God. Loving the sound of our voice so much that we're staring at our captivated audience next to us rather than on the road that we're driving ahead. Again, that's not going to end well. And so, if that's the danger of foolish words, it's worth asking, what do wise words look like? Like, how do we actually speak words that give life instead of tear down and take it away? What are words that find favor or give grace? The words of the wise give grace. And again, if you think about what wisdom is, how wisdom works, wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. And so wise words begin with God. They begin with his character, with his purposes, and specifically, they begin with what he has done to rescue us from our folly and our sin, and to change our hearts through the gospel of his Son. Words always flow from the heart. If you want to know what's inside, listen to what's coming out. Words always flow from the heart. Wise words flow from a heart that has been transformed by Jesus. So if I want my words to be life-giving, that's the well I need to draw from. Not my ambitions, not my grudges, but from the work that Christ has done in me to change my life. That's where wisdom comes from. It's easy if I'm drawing on some other well to just, nitpick or speak whatever criticism or judgment pops into my brain. But when is the last time that I drew from that well of wisdom in order to speak gospel truth into the life of a brother or sister in Christ, to remind them who they are in Jesus, that they are a child of God whose greatest need has been eternally satisfied in the Son, who are cleansed and clothed in the righteousness of Christ, who stand before God completely pardoned and fully accepted and utterly loved. When's the last time you told somebody that's who you are? And don't forget it. Those are words that give life. Parents, when's the last time you told your kids that you will love them no matter what happens, just as Christ has loved you? Do they know that? Do you remind them of that stability of love? Children, when's the last time you thanked your parents for the ways that they love you and reflect your Heavenly Father? Does our speech give grace? Does it build up? Does it give life? Or does it self-destruct and tear down? Foolish speech is a deadly obstacle. But the gospel of Jesus gives us wisdom to avoid that hazard. And so we've seen the danger of robbing others, of rushing mindlessly into a task, of running our mouths. That brings us finally then to revelry and laziness, the danger of selfish indulgence. One more hazard to avoid here. In other words, making all of life a party. The danger of revelry and laziness which is like driving down Dean Road with your eyes fixed on the bottom of a beer glass. Don't recommend, right? So look again at verses 16 to 19. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of the nobility and your princes feast at the proper time for strength, not for drunkenness. Through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. What we see in these verses is the foolishness of irresponsibility and self-indulgence. So trying to treat life like one big, meaningless party, which is problematic for anybody, right? Life will not go well that way, but it's particularly problematic when it happens at the top level of leadership, which is what the preacher's addressing here. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child. Phil Ryken gives one wonderful example of this from European history. Charles XII, who became king of Sweden when he was only a teenager. The wild behavior of Charles and his friends included riding on horseback through his grandmother's apartment, knocking people to the ground in the city streets, and practicing firearms by shooting out the windows of the royal palace. In response, the leading preachers of Stockholm all agreed to preach from Ecclesiastes 10:16 on the same Sunday, pronouncing woe on a land with a child for a king and princes that feasted in the morning. Now, of course, again, kings are not the only potential idiots out there, right? We can all do stupid, foolish, self-indulgent things. And when life is little more than a party, we often find ourselves spending all of our energy on being entertained and having nothing left for what we're actually supposed to be doing in life. It's hard to get out of bed and go to work with a hangover, or when you've been up all night watching YouTube or playing video games. Revelry breeds laziness. A life of endless entertainment leads to a life of uselessness for others. The kind of revelry and laziness that puts off important tasks like fixing a roof before it caves in from the downpour yesterday. All the while justifying our self-centered behavior with the motto of verse 19, which I think the preacher says here satirically, that bread is made for laughter, wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. That's the motto of the sluggard. And again, this comes from a very, very small view of God and a rather inflated view of ourselves. If God is small and I'm the main thing, why wouldn't I live this way? Why wouldn't I just try and give myself to endless entertainment? Again, like all foolishness, it's not going to end well. It's deadly trying to walk through life with your eyes fixed on the bottom of a glass. But when you reflect on the preacher's warning here, the saddest part of this is not just the inherent danger. The saddest part is the waste of life. It's the waste of life. That we were meant for so much more than simply being entertained or endlessly seeking for fun. God did not create you and give you life in vain, for no purpose, without reason. He made you in his image so that you might know him the way a child knows their father, to serve him as a beloved and loyal subject serves a worthy and just and loving king. We were made for more than entertainment. And God did not send his son to rescue you in vain either. He sent his son to rescue you for a purpose, that you would be redeemed for his purposes. Not just to do whatever you want to do in life, but to honor the Lord and serve the cause of his gospel. And the purposes of God are so much grander and so much more fulfilling and sustaining than anything we might try and squeeze life from in this vaporous world. There's no better place to be. And so the problem in these verses is not wine or feasting or celebration. Those are all good things. In fact, Ecclesiastes has commended all of them earlier in the book. The problem is that when we use these good things in irresponsible ways, when we forget what they're actually for, using them for our own self-indulgent purposes instead of for God's purposes. Bread was not made for laughter. According to verse 17, it was made for strength. Wine was made for celebration, not for drunkenness. And the wise, responsible king or person or leader or whatever category you fill, the wise person will use these things according to God's given purpose for them, to serve his kingdom, to enjoy life on his terms, and to bring glory to his name. That's what they're there for. And we need wisdom to keep each of those things in their place for God and for his purposes. When you think about walking through life, traveling that road, there's no way to fully know what we're going to encounter, what's going to be around the bend, what dangers or obstacles stand between us and our destination. But godly wisdom opens our eyes to walk faithfully with God on the often uneven path of life. It opens our eyes not just to the danger of folly and to avoid those hazards, but to making the most of the time God gives us, to living wisely. And it keeps our eyes fixed on the gospel of Jesus. You want to live wisely, see wisely, speak wisely. Keep your eyes fixed on the gospel of Jesus, who he is, what he has done to deal with our sin and to establish God's kingdom through his life, death, and resurrection for us. That is what wisdom opens our eyes to. And that gospel is what we remember and celebrate this morning through the Lord's table. You know, when you think about communion, which the first Sunday of each month we celebrate communion together as a church family, when you think about this meal, it's somewhat ironic that this is a meal made for fools. It's made for fools who have turned their backs on God, fools who have taken advantage of others, who've thought too highly of themselves, who have used their words as weapons, who've wasted what's been entrusted to them. This table is for fools like us, but it's for a certain kind of fool. It's for one who recognizes his foolishness over against the wisdom of God. It's one who confesses his foolishness and his utter need for Jesus Christ. That's the kind of fool that this table is for, one who has been delivered from his folly and sin and who needs that constant reminder that Christ is still enough.